Fantastic. Great. Now recording has begun. I think we might formally begin. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we're meeting on traditional Aboriginal land across the country and pay my respects to elders past and present. Sovereignty was never ceded. My name is Alison Barnes and I'm National President of the Mighty National Tertiary Education Union. I'd like to welcome you all to today's forum. It's fantastic to have so many mighty NTU members here, but I'd also like to welcome those of you who might be considering joining our union. We can achieve so much when we all stand together. Before we begin today's discussion on working in the third space and why it matters for our sector, I have one quick announcement and some housekeeping notes. On May the 14th, the federal government will deliver its budget. So I'd like to invite you all to join us for an NTU analysis of what the budget means for staff and students across our sector. During this meeting, we'll not only be analysing the budget, but we'll be doing the international launch of Education International, who is our global union federation, their campaign for public funding for universities across the globe. So it should be a really exciting event. Lisbeth is going to put the link to registration in the chat, so please come along if you're free. I'm now going to move to housekeeping notes for this session. We've received a lot of questions in advance, which is fantastic, and we'll be answering as many of those as we can, and some of you will get back to you after the meeting. After we have our presentations, there'll be 15-20 minutes for questions, and we'll answer some of those that have been sent to us, but it's also the opportunity for all of you in the audience to ask your questions. So if you'd like to ask a question, raise your hand using the function you can see at the bottom of your screen, and I'll call on you to speak. To ensure that everybody can be heard, we mute all microphones while people are talking. If you have any further questions for the NTU after this session, please email them to ecampaigns@nteu.org.au. That's ecampaigns@nteu.org.au. So we're going to kick off our today's presentation with our NTU Victorian Division Assistant Secretary for Professional Staff, Ruth Jelly. Ruth worked as a learning designer at La Trobe University, Melbourne University and Swinburne University. She's a strong advocate for open educational practices and has published on this topic. After Ruth, we're going to have Sue Sharp. Sue is a senior educational designer with a special interest in assessment, accessibility and inclusion and third space work. Sue has worked in higher education for over 15 years in professional, teaching focused roles, academic and management roles. And earlier this week, she was elected to an NTU endorsed professional staff representative on the ANU Academic Board. Big congratulations to you, Sue. Katie Lee, our final speaker, is an educational focused lecturer at the University of Canberra. She's NTEU ACT Division President, and she has over 20 years experience in education across different sectors, both in professional and academic roles. So welcome to all our speakers. Great to have so many of you here, and I'm now going to pass to Ruth to kick us off.
Terrific. Thanks very much, Alison. And welcome to the third space, everybody. Can somebody give me a thumbs up or an indication that the screens are working? Great. So today we are talking about working at the academic professional interface. So let's have a look quickly at what the third space is. What is it that we're talking about here? It's that space in higher education that straddles the divide between academic and professional work, and it combines elements of both academic work and professional work. So some examples in this space, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with these. I see a lot of familiar faces in this session today that I haven't seen for quite some time, so hi everyone. So some examples include learning technology, curriculum design, education accessibility. We've had a lot of feedback as well. People are very interested about the scientific and technical overlaps in this space as well. People who are doing specialist and technical research and the issues that they face there. Today, the speakers that we have, as you heard from the introduction, have more of a wealth of experience in curriculum design and in the educational design space, but we are very keen to hear from our colleagues and comrades from those other scientific and technical spaces as well. So let's start with having a look at some of the issues that we find in this space. Role definition is something that is definitely very contentious in this space. What we're finding is there's an inconsistency of roles across the sector. I found this in my own working experience. Even when you're trying to jump from one institution to another, trying to understand what it is expectations are going to be of the role that you're stepping into, and how they're using, in my case, learning designers in different contexts and different projects presents its challenges. And there's varying types of work. So the delineation between specific roles for academic staff and other roles for professional staff is also an issue in the sector. So we know of one institution, for example, that classifies educational designers or developers as academic staff levels. Actually, I think I know a second university that does that too. Whereas professional staff will be called, who do similar work, will be called learning designers. And within the issues that come up with role definition, lack of clarity around these roles is a significant issue, and that's caused by the very overlapping nature of this third space work. And this in itself can actually create conflict between workers who essentially are trying to achieve the same outcome. So we're all in the learning design space, which is obviously where I have come from. We're all trying to achieve excellent learning outcomes for students who are coming through whichever institution it is we're working at, and offering, great learning experiences in whatever format that might be. So that might be face-to-face learning, it might be purely online learning, it might be a combination of both. And the academics that professional staff are working with have the same sort of outcomes, but the issues with the role definition and working out who's responsible for what can create conflict in here. And that becomes an occupational health and safety hazard. One of the other issues in here is about research and professional development. So unfortunately, in our sector, a workers' classification determines how much access they have to professional development. In many cases, too many cases across our sector, professional staff are restricted from engaging in research to further their expertise in their own field. There's other issues around research, and from the other side of the divide in terms of researchers, so academics working in third space spaces, who also have issues with the recognition of their work and the significant contribution that has to the research body of knowledge. And Sue's going to talk about that a little bit more in a few moments. So professional staff who are, for example, working in learning design fields often have a lack of access to even a research ethics panel. So if you're not in a department that's part of a school or a faculty, then you don't have sort of a home ethics committee that you can actually approach and put forward ethics applications to in order to conduct your own research. So that's just one of many barriers. So Sue's going to talk about a bit more of that in a few minutes. And Katie's also going to have a look at or talk about some of the issues associated with role definition. So this is quite prevalent in many guises. So it's a many flowers bloom from this one issue of role definition and access to research and professional development. But you'll notice that a lot of the issues we're talking about today, particularly from the professional staff perspective, they apply to all professional staff across the sector. There's a lot of similarities here. And so there's a bit of crossover. We're trying to focus on what's specific to staff who are working in the third space and in between. I've noticed as well that stability and security of work is a big issue in this field. And unfortunately, I think it's because these roles are often seen as new or emerging, and employers are therefore using that as an excuse to make them insecure roles. We see, and I've seen a lot, in fact, I did a lot of fixed term contracts or even casual work that's classified as project based, when in fact what the university is trying to do is introduce new curriculum initiatives, such as a shift to blended learning models, for example. But the work you're doing is actually ongoing, because once those models are introduced, they're not going to disappear. You're not going to suddenly switch back to doing something different. They're going to continue. And the nature of the introduction of that work and the continuation of that work is that you need to continue to learn from it and apply new skills. And you need to be working in collaboration. So everybody who's working in space who wants to ensure that these are really successful educational experiences for students need to be continually improving. And that goes from everything from learning more about the technology, learning more new tools, how to implement new tools, how to testing them with students, and all of those myriad issues that I'm sure many people in this room are very familiar with. But the roles that we do when we're employed to do that are often fixed term. So, for example, I worked in the sector for a decade. Only 3 years of that was on an ongoing contract. The rest of it was project work. But I think a colleague of mine was successfully converted after the union pointed out to the university that there's some issues with the way they have defined project-based work. Anyway, I digress. So some projects have high expectations of rapid rollout, which is also increasingly leading to outsourcing of this type of work. And managements often lack the experience and understanding of the work that's involved, particularly in curriculum design. And so they see, okay, well, let's just outsource this particular, like somehow you can cleave off the work that people do in this very specific sphere. And outsource it to another organization that is working towards specific goals to meet whatever their contract obligations are. And that means that workers are working on university work, but not under our NTEU negotiated EBA conditions. So they're often doing the same work for less pay. And again, issues of conflict arise because these are workers who aren't inducted into the culture of the university, and they're not necessarily driven by achieving the same outcomes as the university. So the same, like the external contracted workers might actually be told that your goal here is to develop X number of subjects in 6 months, as opposed to, well, we need to develop educational experiences that fulfill all of our academic criteria and policies and ensure that there's good practice that can be engaged throughout doing that. And also actually caring about your colleagues when you're sitting down and working with people, developing their units that they are going to teach, having some empathy for what the marking turnaround is going to be, for example, when you're setting the timeline for when the assessments are going to be due, that's a really important task. You can't just blithely go in and say you've got an assessment due, let's have an assessment due every week, a little mini assessment, and have that be turned around within 3 days. You need to understand what it is when you're working side by side. So the other aspect I want to talk about is the money. So in some cases, the core academic work of curriculum development is being shifted onto professional staff. And we know by definition, professional staff are paid less. So usually in curriculum design, for example, you'll find that most curriculum design work amongst professional staff is done at about Q7, which doesn't even equate to level B level salaries at the end of the day. So this begs the question, should this work be classified as professional work, or is it actually academic work? And are universities, in classifying it as professional work, actually trying to save money on how the work is done because they can get away with paying us less? So some of the work in this situation is actually also being done by teaching focused academics. And that is something that I will leave Katie to discuss a little bit further in a few moments. But for now, I'm going to hand over to Sue and she can take over from here.
Thank you so much, Ruth. Before I speak to the issues, I really want to acknowledge that third space is large and it's diverse, and the diversity of context is what invites us to these roles. And in fact, those differences are often what make us more skilled and why the universities want us in these third spaces. And when we try to summarise diverse groups, we lose the nuance and the important features. And I think that's sometimes what happens with the academic and professional classifications. They're not allowing for these third space shades of grey. We don't want to erase the differences. We want to highlight the differences, because third space staff, they're not often well defined by their job title. So the diversity is often really central to their identity, and their diversity is often central to their role. Keeping their context and not losing the details can be really important to their identity. So I want to give you some details about my context and explain my perspective and my own third space identity a little. And I was thinking about Venn diagrams quite a bit as we created this presentation. And so I started thinking about my background as a Venn diagram. So in chunks, I would have a chunk for my business degree and creating and running my own business. I would have a chunk for working in healthcare in mental health and disability. I would have a pretty big chunk for teaching in health science as a teaching-focused academic. And then a pretty big chunk in program coordination and in policy as a head of department of one of those programs. And then an increasingly large chunk in learning design and education design, where I focused a lot on assessment, and this little kind of budding and kind of growing chunk on inclusivity and accessibility. So I've been an academic and I've been a professional, but my lens is particularly professional with a bit of an equity lens. And Katie is going to speak later to the academic lens just to really ensure that perspective is adequately represented. I also want to identify that I'm going to sometimes say an academic classified third space staff member or a professional classified third space staff member. And I don't do that to divide us, but to acknowledge us. Academic and professional classified third space staff have some really some common needs, but their differences shouldn't be minimised. And I'm not going to try to amalgamate everyone into one. We know that doesn't work very well, because then again, you lose the context. But just be aware that when I speak about these two different third space staff members, please just be aware so when I'm talking about this, please be aware that none is more important than the other. What a staff member is classified as doesn't necessarily even link to their identity. As Ruth mentioned, definitions of academic and professional can be arbitrary. One institution classifies educational designers as professional and another classifies them as academic. And there's another example of academic developers who are sometimes classified as professional and sometimes as academic. So there's a lot of variation here. Neither is more important than the other. So in terms of these 4 issues I want to speak to, I'll start with freedom of speech. Universities often provide freedom of speech to academics and to students, but not to professional staff. And that makes it really difficult in the third space to research our own field, but also to advocate. So there's a gap in research in the third space. We don't know enough about ourselves. We don't know enough about our work because we're not given adequate time and money, but also adequate leeway to make sure that we can go and do that research. Staff can sometimes be really afraid to speak out about how things are. And I've recently seen a situation where a research paper about issues in the third space wasn't submitted because of fear of institutional reprisal. There's already issues with career progression. They didn't want to potentially halt that any further. Putting that together, as Ruth alluded, third space staff are often denied professional development time and money. They're restricted from research in various ways. So as Ruth mentioned, no access to ethics approval sometimes. So some of the problems that emerge from that, I've seen third space staff who've stepped over a divide where they've come from an academic role into a professional role in the third space, and they've really realised that it's risking their career mobility because they can't keep up with research, they can't maintain their research profile, and their career mobility gets impaired. Linked to that in terms of credit and authorship, traditional academics are typically acknowledged for their work and their research, but third space staff across the sector are typically not. Often the work that we're doing is on behalf of the university. And this has led to some really bizarre situations. One, a project where half the collaborators were completely unacknowledged until an academic spoke up and said, hey, this is a bit odd, I don't like this. But it was completely at their, it was because of them that that acknowledgement happened. And this isn't a fault of staff members. It's an institutional approach that starts to pit staff against each other or set up unnecessary hierarchies that we just don't need. And there are lots of examples where credit and authorship is a problem. So, for example, research assistant contributions being unacknowledged, learning designers creating learning resources that are only attributed to the academic, library staff supporting the discovery phases of research really substantially, or teaching-focused academics that are undertaking time and work with students that goes uncredited, or creating content that other staff just inherit and use. Our sector has been discussing student plagiarism and cheating quite a bit recently because it's not ethical to build on the ideas of others without acknowledging where they came from. And so we're saying this on one side, and then we're not acknowledging our third space staff work on the other. And I have been completely floored over the last few months that across the sector, we're currently discussing how students and staff should be appropriately acknowledging the contributions of AI, but they're not acknowledging the work of humans. Taking work of others and repurposing it as your own is increasingly acknowledged as unethical. It is unethical, and it's rightly becoming less tolerated by students in academia, and it shouldn't be tolerated anywhere here. It's good ethical modelling for institutions to show how they acknowledge people even when they can take their work without doing that. It's important to do the right thing. So it also increases the responsibility of people who are writing documents, because it means that those people have to stand behind the documents that they write. It's been mentioned quite a few times that good third space work is often invisible. When you do it right, you don't see it. But that's not an excuse. It's standard practice in other invisible fields to acknowledge those invisible workers. So, for example, web designers, editors, artists, they can all find space to acknowledge their work, and they can allow those that are benefiting from them to show the appropriate respect and appreciation. In terms of visibility, when you combine those first two, you get a problem. When staff can't speak out and they can't take credit for their work, they become largely invisible. And work that isn't seen is often not valued. And even more problematically, it's often not funded. So money goes where value is seen, and this can lead to lower prioritising or insecure funding for third space work. And that links a lot to stability that Ruth discussed. Some third space staff are not as respected because of their invisible work, and so they spend a lot of time doing what's called legitimacy work, and essentially calling on relationships and favours that they could instead just be doing their work during that time. In another instance, I was really concerned to see that the university's Accord report, the final report, didn't have any mention of third space staff, or even professional staff, other than a single sentence acknowledging that they're pretty important. One sentence and nothing on third space staff. If this is a roadmap for our potential future, I find it really problematic. And that's a visibility issue. Visibility must increase. Visibility has a flow-on effect for career progression too. So evidence for promotion is obviously hard to provide when you can't take credit, you don't have any authorship, you can't say what you've done. And there's a lack of time and access to PD and research that would prevent your own development that support those pathways. And as I mentioned before, academics often lose their career progression opportunities by shifting into the third space. I think that's combined quite badly with another issue that promotional criteria for traditional academic staff is really well defined, but third space staff don't have that certainty. Academic classified third staff are often in new areas where there's not a lot of precedent for how this is going to work. And then third space staff just across the whole of the third space are often in siloed roles, temporary roles, or newly created roles. And so they often don't have hierarchy, they don't have traditional pathways to promotion. And so you end up being stuck in a career dead end. Thanks for listening to me chat a little bit from a more professional lens. Now, I have alluded to the academic classified third space side, but I can't do that justice fully. So I'm going to invite Katie to speak more to that now.
Thanks very much, Sue. So I've had the opposite journey to Sue. I started in the third space and then moved to an education focused role as an academic. So my beginning in this particular space was as a liaison between third-party providers and the university staff, mostly academics, trying to get them to create offerings, but also to professional staff trying to get university systems and provider expectations to match up, which is an impossible task. Particularly in the early days when the third-party providers didn't necessarily have the on-the-ground educational expertise that they do now. I'd also like to acknowledge that this was Sue's slide first, but I've repurposed it to sort of demonstrate that we have a lot of the same issues, but just from slightly different perspectives. And on that, this isn't a them and us situation. There are pressures on both the academic and the professional staff within the third space issues. And at times, I think we see management deliberately use that tension to their advantage, blaming one side or the other for us not being cooperative, but I'll talk about that in a minute. I'm also going to warn people, I sort of think of it as a trigger warning. I'm going to use the words content creation to describe what a lot of the work that happens in the third space. This comes out of an interaction with one of my children after I had spent a few days recording lectures earlier in the year, and I had this little head poke into my office and go, don't forget to like and subscribe. Much of the work that we're finding that academics are undertaking within the third space and in that interaction is content creation. But please don't take offense to the word, it is quite deliberate. The challenge that we've got here is that the overall issue of the third space is, from an academic perspective, is morphing into one of academic work. What it is today has changed and evolved from times past. I suspect, Alison, that needs to be another Friday forum of its own. But when we start unpicking the third space, there's a challenge of, and another thing. There's always another issue, there's always more. So academic, freedom of speech, freedom of that sort of issue. So during bargaining, our DVCA told us that there was no such thing as academic freedom or freedom of speech on educational matters, that was reserved for research, for the research focus of the academics. And in my particular context, we're undergoing a university-wide curriculum change. We need to support both halves of this equation, but the academics are increasingly losing their ability to make educational decisions based on the needs of their discipline. One small way, I'm going to call it small, but it's probably a lot bigger, that we're seeing this play out is that for both the third-party provider and internal third space offerings, educational content is required to be evergreen or write once, use forever, with little or no reference to current events. Now, I lecture in communications, but the example I'll use is an economics one. We can't talk about what the Reserve Bank has said. We can't talk about recent events because that will date what it is that we're putting together. Assessment needs to be of particular types. So for example, as I said, I lecture in communication. Live presentations are not an assessment type that I can have anymore to cater for the needs that are set out for me. My judgment as a communication academic is, in this instance, largely irrelevant. Moving on to credit and authorship, and also one of visibility. A large issue that we have in the academic space here, and with the use of third-party providers. So when I say that, it's organisations like KeyPath and DeSere and others, and universities are starting to run similar programs internally. So academic content might be created by one group of staff, say a sessional or ongoing or third-party provider, and then delivered by another. So currently happening to me, my unit has gone through this process as an internal offering. So January, February, I spent my time creating videos, doing lectures, doing online work. And now it's delivered by another academic, a sessional staff member. I've lost complete visibility of the content. They also don't have the ability to update anything, which is an academic freedom in and of itself. But I get questions from the students because it's my voice that they hear and my name, which is associated with it. Additionally, there's the potential for what I have recorded to be amended without my consent or knowledge, or changed, changing the intent or the accuracy of what I originally said. This can be a bigger issue when people who are outside their area of expertise are brought in to teach, particularly in a sessional capacity. This happens in relation to the third-party content as well. At a recent members meeting, and this is going to be a larger issue, I suspect, we had issues raised by Indigenous members about the way that their lectures, particularly ones that contain their own personal stories and their own backgrounds, the way that they have been reused and repurposed without their consent or their knowledge. And it was actually a student who saw one of the academics saying to her, "Hey, I saw a video that you made in my class. It was a really great story," that she even knew that it had happened at all. I suspect a lot of people are going to have a lot to say about that one. On the career progression side, there are challenges with student evaluation. So who is the one responsible for negative feedback on teaching design, on delivery issues, if there's been a technical glitch? For example, one of my lectures completely disappeared out of a system and I couldn't do anything about it. And the sessional who was hired to teach that particular unit also couldn't do anything about it. Who takes responsibility there? The timelines on the creation of content with Gantt charts and color-coded timelines, letting everybody know who's running behind and where the pressures need to be applied. Internally, we refer to these as the weekly list of shame. It is something which has been used punitively and also doesn't always take into account academic timetables and other teaching or research commitments. So, for example, please have these hours of videos created by this point. Yeah, but I've got face-to-face classes I need to do my marking for at the same time. Now, as an education-focused staff member, I see these things as a really huge challenge, because how am I, when I'm going for promotion, supposed to show innovation in my teaching and progression in my teaching when all of the conditions have been set and the need to maintain that one-size-fits-all approach, the need for me to engage in scholarship and SOTL is really curtailed when I don't have as much control over what it is that I'm doing. I'm going to finish here. But the evolution of this is an area of academic work, which a dear colleague of mine says has danger written all over it. With the expectations of timelines, the reliance on sessional or fixed term contract staff who don't have the security of employment to push back, or at times the experience to understand the challenges of being asked to do. Add into this the emergence of AI and what some management may see as an opportunity to automate, be that grade assessment, providing feedback, or creating content. So I'm going to hand back over to whoever is coming next.
Fantastic. Thank you, Katie. Hey, thanks to our three fantastic speakers. That was certainly very interesting and I learned a lot.